Good evening, everyone. My name is Caroline Costin. I'm co-chair of events at the Harvard Club of the United Kingdom. I'm very pleased to welcome everyone this evening to the inaugural event of the Climate and Green Economy Group. As many of you know, the Harvard Alumni Association has a wealth of community interest groups called SIGs, or Significant Interest Groups. The environment is certainly a significant interest, and I was thrilled when Sylvia Klimaki reached out to me about starting a climate SIG in the United Kingdom. We had a few environmental talks in the works, so the timing was perfect. And I told Sylvia to reach out to the existing Harvard Alumni SIG in Cambridge. Unbelievably, an environmental SIG did not exist. There are more than 60 SIGs and not a single one was dedicated to the environment. So we quickly got to work. Now, this doesn't mean that Harvard alumni have been silent on environmental issues. At exactly this time last year, during the Harvard and Yale game, the climate change protesters stormed the field, demanding that Harvard and Yale stop investing in oil and gas companies. This spring, Harvard alumni elected 5 new members to the Board of Overseers, including 3 candidates who were backed by Harvard Forward, a group that ran its campaign on an environmental ticket, seeking to address the climate crisis. The alumni have spoken, and the environment is clearly a very significant interest now. On that note, I'm very pleased to kick off this first event, and we'll hand the talk over to Peter Barnett and Sylvia Klimaki to introduce our speakers. I look forward to meeting everyone in person soon, and just a quick note that the call is being recorded today. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for joining this kickoff event. I'd like to start by thanking Caroline Costin and also thanking Sylvia Klimaki, who founded and is the driving force behind this new climate and green economy group. This is the first of what we plan to be a series of events bringing together the alumni community. It's great to see such a large and diverse audience. Climate change has a number of different dimensions. I work as a climate lawyer at Client Earth, a legal NGO, and encounter these every day. From sea level rise displacing island communities, to cheap renewable energy forcing out coal, to young people suing their pension funds for financial mismanagement of climate change risk. The human impacts are the most stark and the most cruel, falling disproportionately on those most vulnerable and yet who have done least to contribute. The economic impacts are also increasingly stark, and here there is some good news. Now more than half of global CO2 emissions are covered by net zero targets. Climate change poses clear financial threats, but the shift to a green, decarbonized economy also offers tremendous opportunities. That net zero transition will touch upon every sector of the economy and every area of our lives. That is why we hope that this broad cross-section of alumni will provide such an effective forum for ideas and action. So welcome and thank you for your support. Our first topic is greenwashing. Our 2 speakers are 2 of the most influential and effective in this area, and I'll now hand over to Sylvia to introduce them. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Caroline. The topic of our inaugural event, as Peter said, we believe is a quite pertinent one, differentiating green good deeds from ghastly greenwashing. As mainstream attention increases around the issue of climate change, so does the demand for scrutiny of the accuracy of companies' green claims. The last 6 months will be remembered as the time when environmental, social, and governance investing exploded. In the first quarter of 2020 alone, despite the market turmoil, sustainable funds attracted over $46 billion according to data from Morningstar. But despite the boom driving global ESG assets and criteria standards remain opaque and fragmented, with an ever-increasing push from stakeholders and shareholders demanding more accountability from companies in respect of their ESG practices. Sustainability is no longer a nice to do, but a must do. And this is a risk in itself, as more and more companies quickly try and jump on the sustainable bandwagon. Greenwashing increases I believe we're more or less familiar with the term, but to put it simply, greenwashing is positive communication about the environmental practices of a company that actually has quite poor environmental practices. And greenwashing can happen either intentionally or unintentionally. But as the world embarks on the climate action journey, investors need to be wary of greenwashing practices and consider who is actually walking the sustainability walk and not just talking it. And this is what we will consider today. And to do so, we have two distinguished speakers. Carol Ferguson heads up the investor research team at CDB, a leading climate and environmental NGO, which has been driving action on climate through their platform for their global investor audience. CDB's Science-Based Targets Initiative, in partnership with the United Nations and other NGOs, encourages companies to set greenhouse gas emission reduction targets in line always with climate science. And Dylan Tanner, who is the founder and executive director of Influence Map, a think tank providing investors with critical analysis on corporations and climate change. Influence Map's leading report on the 50 most influential companies on climate policy examines how financial institutions perform on climate, assessing their financial portfolios. And without further ado, I would like to ask Dylan to share his initial thoughts and some of his research with us. Carol will follow next. I will then be asking some questions, and we plan to spend the last 15 to 20 minutes for our Q&A session. So please feel free to send us your questions through the Q&A room. You can see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Peter will make sure that we gather all these questions, and we'll try to answer as many as possible, consider the time limitations. Dylan, the digital floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, Peter, and Caroline, and delighted to be addressing the Harvard Club of the UK. I'm Dylan Tanner. I run Influence Map, which is a think tank dedicated to playing a part in resolving the climate issue. I lead a team of 30 dedicated mission-driven individuals globally, whose remit is to do just that. Our main program is to look at corporate lobbying on climate, and this is quite a murky issue that is not well understood, but I will explain in the next few minutes how it's presented what we think is the major blockage to the needed climate action, and also some solutions to how it's being addressed and hopefully swept away to allow policymakers to address what needs to be done on climate. So I want to share a few graphical images with you to help you understand what we do. So I want to start with a really important statement from the IPCC. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and this is the group of the world's climate scientists, 10,000 or more of them, under the UN, and they provide the UN system with a scientific consensus on climate change, climate science. And these are not just physicists and chemists, these are economists and technologists and policy scientists. And essentially, as you may be aware, scientists are rather reluctant to make advocacy suggestions. Everything has to be very accurate and stuff. But in 2018, they made a rather radical departure and said, look, we need government policy to address climate change. We need to address an unprecedented transition in our energy systems over the next decade. And this cannot happen without intervention from governments in terms of binding regulations. This is essentially what was said back in 1997, the Kyoto Agreement, which I actually attended because I grew up in Japan and I was there. And we saw at the time a big political movement to implement a carbon tax. And Al Gore flew in and said, we're all going to come together as a global community, and carbon tax being applied globally was top of the agenda. So we all know what happened to that. And this is a brief accelerated history lesson over the ensuing 20 years. The carbon tax got diluted to an EU emissions trading scheme, which was so complicated that it was easy for companies to game and water down. And different climate policy strands in different parts of the world were subsequently lobbied, terminated, or watered down, or substituted. Anyway, the net result is we do not have the climate policy that we needed, we need now, and hence that statement from the IPCC about a year ago. The issue with this is the longer we delay this, the more urgent and draconian the policy will be, and there's a risk of a disorderly transition. What tends to happen in in environmental emergencies is governments do act when it becomes unbearable, which I believe it may be the case in the next few years, and the results on the economy are unpredictable. A big reason for all of this inaction has been corporate lobbying. We did a study with the New York University of Law. We looked at, or rather they looked at the impact of Trump-era regulatory rollbacks, and they found a cumulative 5% increase in emissions by 2025 as a result of these rollbacks. That's double the emissions of Spain, just due to lobbying, or rather just due to these regulatory rollbacks. Our work traces the lobbying power behind these to several well-funded and powerful US industry associations. So the American Petroleum Institute, the National Mining Association, but the National Association of Manufacturers and the US Chamber of Commerce, two very powerful groups who are pushing for this deregulation. Their membership is a who's who of corporate America. All of the big companies, Fortune 500 companies. Very few of those companies stood up and complained while this was being done, and despite the huge disconnect between their own corporate statements and what their powerful industry groups were doing on their behalf. So we do think the impact of companies on climate goes beyond just their physical emissions. Climate lobbying is a huge impact. The impact, as you may imagine, a company like Exxon, which publicly advised George Bush to pull out of the Kyoto Protocol, and he said as much. The impact of that arguably is way beyond its own cumulative emissions as one company. So it's very important to track this, and this is what we do. And we are in the 5th year of a program to analyze this in a detailed way. I want to make one comment on how this has progressed. As companies, as it becomes politically unacceptable for companies to be very direct and aggressive in opposing climate action, they've become more subtle with the arguments. We agree with the solution, but we don't want, and then 10 exceptions to why the rules are not acceptable. And some of the more negative work is done by their agents like the American Petroleum Institute. So this subtlety requires a nuanced and very sophisticated process to track it, which we've devised. We don't ask the companies directly, what are you lobbying? We don't feel like we get any kind of answer. So we use a lot of data techniques and aggregate them all together and create metrics for how companies are supporting or not the Paris-aligned policy. This is a snapshot of the results. On the horizontal is whether they oppose or support Paris-aligned policy, essentially action on climate. On the left-hand side is opposition in red. And then on the vertical is the intensity of their lobbying. So this is a kind of a neutral, whether it's high intensity or low intensity. So these are two independent variables. Upper left are the fossil fuel companies actively opposing action on climate change. And you see some of the oil majors there, like BP and Shell, who've made very positive statements on climate. We feel through our numbers that they're still opposing this action. But we do see a number of companies on the upper right who are pulling in the opposite direction. Renewable energy companies want to see this action for their business models, and companies like Tesla and others. So it's not all negative news. We do see a struggle within the corporate sector for and against meaningful climate policy, and to us that's a very positive signal. We've seen more companies enter the upper right-hand quadrant since we started than say in the lower section, which is sitting on the fence. We're not getting involved in the debate. And those are a lot of the companies who remain members of the Chamber of Commerce, but just let it slide when they're being very negative on climate, despite funding that same group. So what do we do with this data? We're not powerful as a group. We're just a bunch of guys sitting in London and New York and Tokyo. We work a lot with the media to help them tell the correct story on companies and climate. And coming back to the greenwash point, this greenwash is very subtle and requires a lot of sophisticated analysis to unpick it. So we're delighted to be working with most of the world's respectable media on this topic, and we have got a lot of coverage, and I think they regard us as a central resource, which they can't really replicate themselves because it takes quite a lot of effort, but reliance on the results. The main stakeholder group we set up to service is the investment community, and we work with the Climate Action 100 program, which is the world's biggest collaborative stewardship program in history. And they are prioritizing the climate issue and pushing good governance on lobbying through the 150 most climate important companies, including most of the oil majors. So that's very positive. It's slow going, but it's one feels that if the shareholders of the companies can't move them, who can? I mean, these are powerful forces. So we are working very hard with the investors on this and see it as a powerful lever for change. I mentioned some positive companies. We do see companies like Unilever, for various reasons, are very strongly supportive of the Paris Agreement. And this goes beyond just saying we support the Paris Agreement. It goes beyond, it goes to pushing and instructing their own lobbyists to get more engaged with climate policy, even though it doesn't necessarily directly impact them in the short term. We've worked with Unilever on their industry groups and misalignments on this. And when the new CEO took his job at the beginning of the year, he sent a letter to all of the company's groups saying you need to get your house in order when it comes to climate lobbying. We have worked with on the companies who are opposing climate policy. The work with investors has pushed a demand for greater disclosure on lobbying through the system. And greater alignment of the company's activities with the Paris Agreement. And we've seen the startings of some progress with Shell and BP have issued disclosure statements on the topic and walked away from some particularly egregious US industry associations. And we hope this will become the norm in the corporate sector. I think there is a lot of power in sophisticated data to unpick greenwash and hold companies to account for what they're doing, as well as the top line statements. And I can see this type of thing accelerating using the combined levers of investors, the media, and also positive companies like Unilever and campaign groups increasingly are interested in our data. So we're not the total Grinch NGO criticizing every company. We do see hope, and we have been pleasantly surprised at how quickly our analysis has been uptaken by these forces, and it's the power of truth, really. Thanks.
Thank you, Dylan, so much, and very insightful presentation. And it's great that you actually close on a positive note, so that it's not all doom and gloom, although it's quite obvious from what you shared with us that the industry, many different industries actually, are not where we think we are, and like their PR positive campaigns are creating a momentum that is actually not meeting their climate actions. So now I would like to invite Carol to share with us her initial thoughts and some bits from her research.
Great, thanks Sylvia for the introduction, and also to Peter and Caroline and the Harvard Club for inviting me to speak. So a bit like Dylan, you know, I've been working in this area for a while, and for the last few years working with a team of analysts to look at how high carbon emitting sectors and major companies within those sectors are positioned to transition to a low carbon economy. And what I'm going to do now is to share a presentation to talk through the type of work we've been doing and trying to address, you know, what the topic of the day, which is, you know, how do you differentiate between the companies who are actually doing what they are supposed to be doing and the ones who are greenwashing. So I'm just going to share my screen with you now. And hopefully you've got that. Okay. So with our work, what we've done is we've adopted a framework called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And this was a framework that came into place a few years ago, so in 2017. And it really was one that was very much championed by central bankers like Mark Carney, who were concerned about sort of financial instability because of what companies weren't disclosing to the market. And so they were very keen that, you know, companies start disclosing what they thought were material in 4 broad areas. So looking at transition risk, physical risk, transition opportunities, and climate governance and strategy. And this is a framework that we adopted, which is very useful because it focuses in on materiality. It's very forward-looking, and it's trying to link climate risks and opportunities to the financial impacts for companies. And so, you know, we have created a whole bunch of metrics that do a deep dive using this framework. And, you know, why is it that suddenly, you know, climate has become such a big issue, not just for regulators, but also for companies? It's because, as, you know, as Dylan was alluding to earlier, I mean, we're basically at a stage on this slide, you can see two graphs, the one on the left showing you the kind of deep cuts that we need to have in emissions to be aligned to achieving or limiting temperature rise to 2 degrees or below by the end of the century. And as you can see on the left-hand side, to get to the sort of 2050 net zero target that, you know, both Peter and Dylan talked about, you need to actually halve your emissions by 2030. So that's pretty, you know, that's quite a lot to do from where we're sitting now. So less than 10 years from now. And the chart on the right-hand side shows you the different trajectories, you know, to achieve these temperature limitations by the end of the century. And, you know, frankly, where we are now, we're very much on a business as usual trajectory, which gets us to a temperature rise of between 3 to 5 degrees, which will have, you know, pretty scary implications, both from a social and economic point of view. And what we found in our analysis is, you know, against this backdrop, companies are still focusing very much on their operational emissions, you know, so-called Scope 1 emissions, with Scope 2 being the energy use in their operational emissions. So very much a focus on Scope 1 and Scope 2. But when you look at these, you know, big industries that are responsible for carbon emissions, a number of their a big proportion of their emissions comes from their activities in the value chain, so both upstream and downstream activities. And these are essentially, defined as scope 3 emissions. And there are several categories of scope 3 emissions. So there are 11 categories, but the two categories that really matter are what's in the supply chain, so purchased goods and services, and use of sold products, so how, what energy you're emitting from the use of your products. And what our analysis shows that, if you look across a number of these sectors, apart from the material sectors, which have very high process intensity. So, if you look at cement and steel, where you have very high scope 1 and scope 2 emissions intensity, that's this graph on the right-hand side. If you look on the left-hand side, the biggest share of emissions really come from scope 3. So, for oil and gas, bulk commodity mining, autos, capital goods, consumer goods, over 90% of emissions come from scope 3. So, with that in mind, looking, for example, at the auto sector, are we really seeing companies focusing their efforts on the area they really need to focus on? So both these graphs, the one on the left-hand side is showing you emission targets for 16 auto companies that we covered in our autos report. And this represents around 80% of global car sales by volume. And if you look at the absolute scope 1 and scope 2 targets, you do see some very ambitious targets, getting down to net zero for some of them even before 2050. But the reality is scope 1 and scope 2 only represents 5% of the sector's footprint. And if you look at the right-hand side and you look at the absolute scope 3 target, so these are use of sold products, the emissions, fleet emissions of cars, only 6 companies have set absolute scope 3 use of sold products. And, and some of these targets are, you'd say relatively ambitious, but not as ambitious as their scope 1 and scope 2. And this is a sector that's actually heavily regulated. Fleet emissions have been regulated for some time. And, now you're getting outright bans of petrol and diesel cars. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the UK's recent moves to, bring that forward from 2040 to 2030. So, quite a regulated sector and where we've seen disruption from, Tesla, bringing in electrical EV technology. So, even for a sector that's regulated where there's technology disruption, you're not really seeing the sort of ambition in scope 3. And what's very interesting is, benchmarked against other OEMs in the capital goods area, this sector is actually doing better than other capital goods sectors, where their end markets are in power generation, transport, and building, all areas that need to meet heavy decarbonization targets. So in this chart, we covered the capital goods sector from different subsectors, and this subsector is essentially the cooling sector. So technologies like refrigeration and air conditioning, which are going to grow in demand as the planet sort of warms up. And particularly in countries like India, where you're going to have a disproportionate rise in temperatures. So part of our analysis, requires, we do a deep dive into, exactly what companies are doing. And for this sector, we did a analysis of the products that they offer in 4 major markets. And this chart shows you the findings for split type ACs into the Indian market. And you can see a whole range of companies that were involved in selling into the Indian market. So you've got Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, LG Electronics, on the left-hand side, and Samsung Electronics and Electrolux on the right. And what we did was we looked at all the products in split type air conditioning that they were offering into the Indian market to benchmark what their products were doing relative to the efficiency standards, set in India. And we used the latest efficiency standards 2021 to 2023. And what you can see is that the median product that they're offering into the market for most companies is outperforming what is essentially not a very ambitious benchmark, but Mitsubishi Heavy here with their median product, 32% outperformance. But if you look at the sort of achievement rate, so their best available technology is even better than that, but they're not offering it as broadly to the market as they should be. And arguably companies are doing, the ones on the left aren't doing too badly at all. But if you look at the IEA scenarios for the cooling sector, that requires something like a 50% improvement in efficiency rates by 20% and an 80% improvement by 2050 to be aligned to Paris ambitions. So, yes, these companies aren't doing too badly against not a probably ambitious regulatory benchmark, but actually, they really should be shipping out better products into these markets. Another example, looking at the consumer goods sector. So here we looked at fast-moving consumer goods companies involved in food and beverage and household and personal care. And we looked both at the risk side of the equation and the opportunity side of the equation. So this slide is essentially showing you our findings on how innovative we think companies have been. And when we look at innovation, we use the theory of innovation, looking at whether companies are doing incremental, radical, or transformative innovation. And incremental innovation is essentially maybe small efficiency gains on a business as usual strategy, whereas transformative innovations are those that are really going to move the dial. And you can see, for the household and personal care companies, you've got companies like Unilever, L'Oreal, P&G, Reckitt Benckiser, Estée Lauder. So, very well-known household names. And I'm happy to say that, our analysis here dovetails with Dylan's findings on Unilever, because we found Unilever actually doing incredibly well in terms of transformative innovation. So these the sort of innovations they're doing are, for example, working with their supply side, with the supply chain, working with small farm holders, introducing agricultural techniques that improve yields, making sure they're minimizing water use, so very, very important to Unilever because it's a big user of soft commodities, and also doing product reformulations, so for example, they've got vegan alternatives in their ice cream products like Magnum and Cornetto, and really doing some good stuff. And L'Oreal also doing a lot of reformulations, both on their products, but also on their packaging to reduce packaging volume. And what we look at is not just impact, but scale. So, our company's rolling this out across the group. So, Unilever again did very well here, rolling out at the group level. Whereas, we found Estée Lauder had some really good innovations, but very much, doing it at the brand level. So, this kind of deep dive research does really give you an insight into some of the companies that are doing a better job than others. Thank you.
Carol, thank you. Thank you so much for a very insightful presentation. And I think it's great to see that you're both mentioning Unilever, for example, and for those of us who are in the space, like Unilever has been a case study for quite a long time now, but it would be good to see some other names popping up and trying to see other sectors having some bright examples. I'm going to turn now into the oil majors. And Dylan, BP and Shell in particular, they've done some like very strong climate-focused campaign, trying to persuade the world that they're being very serious about climate action. But actually, Influence Map's data-driven analysis shows that it's just talk for now. You mentioned that they've done some baby steps, like, you know, on disclosure statements, for example, but still nothing too serious. So in the case of oil majors, what should investors be looking for so that they can identify what are the key practices that they should be looking for, so that they can identify who is being serious about climate action and who isn't?
So they have made statements and indeed some actions, including write-downs of reserves that they think were incorrect based on pressures on oil demand and due to climate issues. That's not something we look at in detail, but in terms of what investors look at, they're interested. I mean, they found it so much misleading information from these companies over so long that, you know, both civil society and investors are somewhat skeptical of taking top-line statements at face value from companies. I mean, that's just investors in general. So the things they look at, from what I understand, in terms of the actual company's business model, are the investments that they're planning in the future in oil and gas versus other investment areas. And those numbers haven't really changed significantly. So again, I'm going to defer judgment on the plan, the Shell and BP announcements, because they're a radical departure from Exxon and Chevron. However, they are not the kind of radical transformation that we would expect or is needed at this stage in the game when it comes to climate. I mean, we have been engaging with all of these companies, and they say, well, how can our score improve? Look at what we're doing. You know, so when you divorce yourself from the American Petroleum Institute and say, look, they don't represent us, or we're leaving them because it's important, that will be a radical departure. They have been unwilling to even make a statement to the effect of saying they don't represent us on climate. So that leads to me to believe that they're not. I mean, that will be a very politically difficult step for them because of the politics that go on in their industry associations and how that works. But it's not, you know, impossible, and it's not, you know, theoretically not that difficult, but they don't want to do that yet. So I defer judgment, but, you know, they have to show the evidence based on their past performance of essentially deception.
Let's hope that will change soon. Carol, there is little visibility in terms of the strategic plans of, like, most companies to achieve alignment with the Paris Agreement climate goals. What can regulators do to measure progress? And is carbon tax something that regulators should push forward quite drastically? Would, like, price on carbon help accelerate climate action?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I'll talk about the carbon tax first, you know, and, you know, obviously, you know, carbon schemes and carbon trading schemes have been around for a while, like the EU ETS. And, you know, the structure of these schemes have got better. But, you know, previously, you know, trying to introduce these schemes, but then, you know, having sort of grandfathering or allocating allowances to the heavy industries that really need to decarbonize hasn't created the right price signal. So, you know, I think one of the things we're going to be struggling with, if you have a carbon price, is whether it's going to be a global price or whether you're going to have these kind of regional schemes. And then if you do have these regional schemes, you know, how do you cope with the sort of commodities or products that are globally traded? So I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but I think that you do need some form of carbon pricing signal, you know, for markets that you know, where a carbon price will definitely influence the way they make their capital allocation decisions. Because, at the moment, there isn't a strong enough price to get people to shift capital the way they need to. I think the other interesting thing regulators are doing is outright bans of products that they don't think fit the bill, which is what we're seeing in the auto sector. And I think that's a very interesting way of getting to sectors and companies to focus. So the one way is by having some sort of pricing signal. But it could be that if your product doesn't fit the bill, it shouldn't be around. Yeah, I think that's kind of an interesting way of driving capital allocation decisions. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up now to some questions from our audience. The first one is from Lynn Jones, and Dylan is addressed to you. You discuss shifting investors. How important is this investment, given Shell and BP records seems unlikely a time for them to change?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
So the question is around disinvestment, right? So
divestment, you mean?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah, no, I read that. So in my view, the investors we speak to, there's a kind of a collaborative engagement process. So I think that the issue with divestment is it doesn't really impact the companies because it's just selling shares and somebody else buys them. It's more of a signal, but that signal, the impact gets diminished over time. The engagement process means you have to actually own the shares to engage with them. So we have like a combined strategy of divesting, but we'll buy back later if you improve, or divesting a bit, going underweight. And so I think there is that collaborative inside outside strategy going on. I think I've read some research that the thing that is most effective is actually engaging and pressuring the companies as opposed to divesting in the secondary market. When it comes to primary market activity like raising new capital, then that's a different matter. But the divestment movement is so far initially focused on just pension funds divesting from companies. But I think that's more merged into a more sophisticated approach where it's just one signal.
Thank you. Another question from our audience, Tom Watzer to Carol. Could you elaborate on what the specific content of the disclosure should be, the nature of the information, to enable investors to evaluate and price the physical and transition risks that a company is exposed to?
Yeah, obviously, the type of disclosure you need to make will vary depending on what sector you're involved in. But I think one of the big issues that investors face, or analysts like us, in assessing companies is that you really need disaggregated information, because a lot of companies tend to disclose on an aggregated basis, and climate is very much happening at different levels. Physical risk is very much a local issue. So I think the more granular the information, the better. And what we find now is that even though companies say they're doing a lot of disclosure, ultimately we use our own analysis using asset level data to be able to evaluate companies and to really pinpoint where things are happening. And we even use regulatory databases and a whole bunch of other databases to be able to find out what companies are doing. So, I don't know whether, I suppose the answer to that question is, yeah, you have to be detailed. And of course, what the TCFD framework is trying to do is trying to get companies to kind of alert investors to areas that they think are material. And there's some very good companies out there, not just Unilever, who are trying to do that, and trying to even give you some sense of what the financial impacts might be. But one of the issues around this kind of disclosure is it's still very much at the voluntary level, and not all the information is verified by third parties. So there's still some way to go before we get complete clarity. And I think your question earlier about strategic plans, there's very, very little disclosure about how capital is allocated to be able to shift business models, and that's the sort of thing you really have to dig around and find out yourself.
And I think, again, it goes back to, regulation. The more we dig into this discussion, the more obvious it is that it's all about regulating the space, and ensuring that there are practices in place that will ensure transparency and disclosure across the board. Another question from our audience is from Haruhiko Matsuda for Dylan. Dylan, can you elaborate on the part played by PR companies to influence people's perception of the climate crisis? It seems, Haruhiko says, that about half of people around me agree that there is a climate crisis, but the remaining half seem to either completely deny or accept the crisis, but believe it can be handled with tech advancement without cutting on CO2 emissions.
Yeah, sure. Let me answer that with a graphic I have that we use to kind of describe a complicated system. Can you see that?
Sorry, yes, we can.
Okay, so the oil and gas industry, they have a strategic desire to see action slow down on climate change and not even initiated. So you can imagine they sit around in a boardroom somewhere with PR agents, internal communications people, their corporate lawyers, and discuss how do we do this. So our job is to try and unpick that activity without actually being there. I mean, we'd love to be there, but they don't let us in. So you're correct in that PR and spin is a really integral part of this. If you convince half of the population that climate change is not real, your battle is won, because the regulators can't act in that environment if the public doesn't think it's a real issue. So there's still a lot of activity going on in the narrative and the spin and the capture of the public discourse on climate. So from the oil and gas companies, obviously they're not going to say that directly, that it doesn't exist, because they would just be ridiculed. Or they would be hammered by investors. So they pursue this narrative that we can solve this using technology. We don't need regulations. You saw those ads from ExxonMobil where half of their ads were about algae producing biofuels, and you would be forgiven for thinking that the company is a biofuels company. And they actually got sued by the Massachusetts Attorney General for false advertising on that. So that's propagated directly. There's more extreme narratives propagated by their industry associations that hint on uncertainty in climate science. And then the stuff that we can't trace back to the companies because of lack of disclosure, are the outright climate denial practiced by think tanks and others. This is particularly a US issue. But the point is, it is a sophisticated process from the narrative capture and spin to actually the regulatory lobbying, which is a handle-turning thing that happens in Brussels, Washington, and Tokyo, and they excel at that. That's done by their industry groups. And then some of the election influencing, particularly in the US, done by think tanks that pump money into Republican and anyway, it's big money politics. That's maybe specific to the US as opposed to Europe, but I mean, it's different tactics, the same result. And you know, this is the toolkit of the lobbyist, and they feel like their businesses are at risk here, and they don't want to change, as far as we can see.
Yeah, thank you, Dylan. I guess I wonder whether you know, even that space could eventually be regulated, and I mean, I assume people are becoming more and more aware about lobbying practices, and they're more cautious about it. But it's clear from your study that it's still very strong, especially in the US, but I believe here in Europe as well. Another question from for Carol from our audience, from Nicoletta Giadrossi. So Nicoletta asks, could you briefly elaborate on the different ratings, CDB, TCFD, CSB, outlining the pros and cons? Nicoletta, she says she's a non-executive director in several companies, and they're aware, and they're looking at what makes more sense for each.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that I know, you know, a lot of people complain about when it comes to the whole ESG space is there are too many ratings and scores, and not all of them match up. And there's a sort of lack of transparency in the rating methodology. So, you know, I think that, you know, unfortunately, I think that's true. There've been, you know, studies to show that. So I think you need to understand what the different scores and ratings are trying to do. So with the CDP scores, which is slightly different to the research that I showed you earlier, what CDP has been trying to do for the last 20 years is to drive transparency in terms of disclosure. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to score companies that are improving their disclosure, benchmarked against their own industry, but also introducing best management practice in that process. You know, so, you know, one, you know, are they disclosing on the things that they need to be disclosing on? And secondly, you know, are they showing leadership in terms of the practices that they need to be incorporating, you know, both from a risk management point of view, but also, you know, recognizing things that they need to do to improve where they sit. And that score is not necessarily going to tell you how well companies are going to perform in the future. You know, it might give you a good sense of the well-governed companies, but, you know, it's not necessarily going to tell you that this is a sector that's not really doing enough. And, you know, so I think the CDP score is very important, and that's something that you definitely want to take on board, but you'd have to do other things to really understand what, from an NED perspective, you know, I just wouldn't take it that a company that has a high rating on some of these scoring systems is doing enough to be able to transition. And for that, you need to do another level of analysis to really understand where the, you know, climate impacts could come through from.
Thank you, Carol. We only have 5 minutes left, so I guess our final question to both of you comes from Peter Barnard of our advisory board. He's asking, can you identify the greatest challenge that you see in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years, and the greatest opportunity to close on a positive note as well? Dylan, why don't you go first?
Yeah.
The greatest challenge is to, I think, to break this logjam that the industry has created, that legislation is not possible and it's not going to work. That said, if we can unpick that and perhaps use the COVID crisis as a mini compressed version of the climate crisis, and reintroduce the need for science-based and evidence-based decision-making by governments, there is an opportunity that we will be able to pass these regulatory measures in a clever way that doesn't disrupt the economy, which by the time span that can happen is limited, and there will still be a lot of losers in terms of the industrial sectors. But that's already, the market's already answering that in the automotive sector and the oil and gas sector. They expect it, so let's hope it happens.
Yeah, and for me, I think that, you know, the greatest challenge is to change the mindset of companies actually, and for them to think, you know, not to wait for regulation, but to be ahead of regulation, you know. And I think that the really good companies have recognized that, you know, and turned it into an opportunity. You know, if you're ahead of the curve, you're going to do better. And one, you know, not having to write off on, you know, bad decision making. And secondly, you know, being first into the market with the right positioning from a business model point of view. So that's what I would say.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both for a very, very interesting discussion and very insightful presentations. We're running out of time, so I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope you became a little bit more knowledgeable around this otherwise quite, I would say, convoluted space. I would like to thank you, Caroline Costin, for making this happen, Peter Barnett from our advisory board who helped put this event together, and of course our distinguished speakers. We have recorded today's discussion. We'll be able to share with everyone else. Our next event is on December 1st with guest speaker John Elkington, who is one of the founders of the global sustainability movement. The event, he's going to speak on the topic of whether the COVID-19 pandemic could become or has become a green swan. So the event will go up on the website soon, and we'll send out the relevant email shortly. And last, I would like to ask everyone to, you know, please send us your feedback. This was our first event. We'd like to hear your thoughts and would love to hear your ideas of other events and other speakers you would like us to host here as part of our green economy and climate group. Thank you everyone for your time and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.